and that's the one that we have to adhere to when submitting for your licensing. This is the financial plan document, and I'll explain it a little bit more towards the end of the presentation. So we're going to take a look at current and future capital needs, identify the financing, look at operating costs over the next 10 years, and then provide recommendations on the rates. Now, obviously, you don't have to approve all of those rates. But it gives you, basically a trend line on where we anticipate your rates being over the coming years. Now, right off the bat, I just wanted to summarize some of the stuff. So we'll lead with some of the observations. So then you know what we'll be talking about. And I think the news that we have today is actually fairly positive. So there is capital costs, a fair amount that'll be identified over the forecast period. The rates that we'll give you are basically on a combined annual bill. So what we've looked at is to make sure that the increases on the total bill are staying within certain percentage increases. And basically, they're marginally above inflation. So if we assume inflation's running at 2%, your combined bill is marginally above that. So, when I say marginally, I'm saying like 2.3, 2.4. That's the magnitude of it. So I think we're in really positive shape, but we'll just be a titch above inflation. So that's why I say I think you've reached a point where you're in relatively good shape. There is a sizable capital program, and which we'll show you, but I think you've reached a point where you've got a solid amount of financial stability that'll assist in that. Now, if you recall, there's two parts of your water bill. There's what's called a base charge, and that's a fixed amount that even if you're down, well, I guess you're not down in Florida, but maybe if you're traveling somewhere and you're not using your water, you're out of the house, there's still a fixed amount that you'll pay to the municipality for your water and your wastewater system. And that's called a base charge. And 86% of Ontario municipalities, when they do their rates, they have exactly the same type of structure you have. There's a fixed amount that you're going to pay monthly or bi-monthly, depending on your billing, but you pay that. And then the second part of it is based on the amount of flow that goes through your meter. You're going to pay a volume rate for both the water and the wastewater side. Now, why I emphasize this is because one of the things is right now that on the water side, that base charge is 32% of the bill. And we've talked with staff about revenue stability. There's a lot of capital expenditures. And in fact, most of your both on the operating and the capital side, your costs are fixed, fairly fixed. 90 to 95% of your water expenditures don't fluctuate with usage because you still need the same amount of staff out there, or you've got sizable bills that you pay to Aqua, and they're maintaining the system. We have to basically cleanse the pipes. We have to, there's a lot of maintenance that has to be done. So your costs don't change as rapidly on volume as they do on, with those fixed charges. So on the water side, we're looking to increase that base charge. So the amount we're going to pay monthly, that fixed amount, we're actually going to move up so that by the time we hit the end of the forecast, we're going to attain 40% of the water bill is going to, or the base charge is going to pay for 40% of your annual expenditures. On the wastewater side, right now, with your current structure, 57% of your wastewater expenditures are covered by that base charge. So only 43 is actually comes in from the volume side of it. And that's where we think the water's a little bit low, and we actually want to step up that base charge. But when we combine the total bill, we're still for water and wastewater, and even though we're making adjustments between the volume and the base, if you look at your water bill, we're still marginally above the inflation every year. So I just want to point out, even though we're making some tweaks between the volume and the base, your water bill is still going to be increasing roughly at just over inflation over the next 10 years. Next slide, please. And then again, please. So these, after Walkerton, and you recall that was a tragedy that happened at the turn of the century, huge inquiry. It was not only Ontario, but it was national and international participants in all of that. And it culminated in a number of pieces of legislation being put out by the province. The Safe Drinking Water Act is the key piece of legislation. It basically directs, the daily testing. It directs the amount of cleansing of the water. So there's a minimum amount. The last drop that goes out has to have a minimum amount of chlorination, or a minimum amount of cleansing as it leaves the system. Operator training, everything is the labs testing, everything for the most part is under the Safe Drinking Water Act. It's the major piece. And it's the one that says you have to be licensed to run your water system. So with that, everything basically tentacles up into that piece of legislation. They had introduced at the same time an act called the Sustainable Water and Sewage Systems Act. And what that was addressing was doing a detailed infrastructure plan. So looking at inventorying all of your infrastructure, looking at the quality of it, how it's performing, and actually coming up with a very long-term capital budget. And then the second part of it was to come up with a financial plan to address that inventory. That piece of legislation actually has been repealed. And if you go down to the fifth bullet, the Water Opportunities Act now stands in the shoes of that piece of legislation. So it's still pending, and as I go through, I'll come back and just hit that one in a tiny bit more detail. But the Water Opportunities Act is the one that you're going to see being implemented fully over the next couple of years. And I'm just going to say the principles that we've applied in the calculations that we've done are basically to meet that water opportunity standard as best as we know it today. So you're well on your way to being no surprises when the additional legislation comes out. You're doing all the right things. You have over the years been doing the right things, so you're in good shape. The third bullet, the OREG 453, that's the one that I spoke of. This is the formal document which we have to submit to the province for your financial plan. It actually is an interim document because originally the Safe Drinking Water Act said that the second one, the Sustainable Water and Sewage Systems Act, was going to develop the financial plan, but as I've noted, they didn't implement it yet, a number of reasons. So they put in this interim piece of legislation under OREG 45307. The Water Opportunities Act will then be the new one, which will replace what we're doing currently. Clean Water Act, I just noted, it basically is watershed management. So basically, for the most part, conservation authorities actually are the ones that provide the oversight on the Clean Water Act. And then at the bottom, the one that I point out is the Infrastructure for Jobs and Prosperity Act. If you recall, that's the one where all municipalities across Ontario have to inventory all of their assets and basically come up with, a plan or approach to maintaining replacing, renewing those assets over time, with specific emphasis on the hard services, your water and wastewater. So when the Infrastructure for Jobs and Prosperity Act, you've completed that for water and wastewater, it will actually, the province will then say, okay, we have the information. We now want you to move ahead with the Water Opportunities Act. So there's kind of like these relationships that are unfolding. So as you finish the Infrastructure for Jobs and Prosperity Act, we're going to move into a new realm under the Water Opportunities Act. And if we just,
So I'll let Gary take a breath. And there's, in his slides, you'll see a lot of legislation related to water, and that's, the Walkerton situation caused a whole bunch of legislation to happen on the water side. But in our studies, we're sort of adopting very similar principles for wastewater as well, even though there's not formal legislation for the wastewater side of things. The analysis that we've done includes the water and the wastewater side, and very similar as far as operating capital and reserves and development charges. So I'll turn it back over to you, Gary.
thanks, Michael. Yeah, it's a good point. Right now, the legislation points to water. But if you look at the Water Opportunities Act and look at the third bullet, preparing sustainability plans, not only for water, but wastewater and stormwater services. So as they roll out the next piece of legislation, it's also going to require you to apply the same principles for wastewater. And as I say, we've applied those principles as best we know them today in preparing the information that we'll be presenting shortly. So the Water Opportunities Act, it's the one that's unfolding. The sustainability plans will have to be prepared. They're not only doing the inventory, but they're taking a look at how you're going to pay for it over time. They're looking at stability. They're looking at climate change, et cetera. So there'll be some added things that'll have to be included as part of these plans. Next. So you can see here it is here. That's a good, I just segued into the next slide. The financial plan. So this replaces the 45307, which is what we have to do today. And I'll explain at the end of the presentation that it's a very narrowed focus. But for water and wastewater, you're going to do an asset management plan, which Aqua and Dylan are preparing the details right now. There's going to be the financial side, which is how do we provide for that? Do we have to increase rates? What's the, our level of debt? Are we funding by reserves, et cetera? And they're also looking, and they're going to establish conservation targets. And we don't know what they are, but that will have to be part of this document that goes back to them. How is your municipality embracing their conservation targets? An assessment of risk. So the fourth bullet, assessment of risk that may interfere with the future delivery of the service. And then the last one talks about strategies for maintaining and improving. And it talks about, basically, or the fourth one talks about climate change. The fifth one talks about, do you need to consider additional technologies in order to fulfill all the requirements above? So right now the words are there. We haven't got the regulations that actually define all of this, but this is the direction that the legislation is taking us. And my discussions with the Ministry of the Environment and the Municipal Affairs, they're waiting for the Infrastructure for Jobs and Prosperity Act process to be completed, and then they're going to move ahead with this Water Opportunities Act. And as I've noted, the Infrastructure for Jobs and Prosperity Act was put into play. Actually, was the legislation, I think, was put out in 2015. There was regulations that set out more of the detailed targets. And basically, this timeline identifies that potentially by 2023, by July, you have to have your asset management plan completed for water, wastewater, storm, and roads, which they've called the core services. And then by 2021, this year, you have to have that completed. By 2023, you have to have it completed for all other services. And then the full financial, the blending of the policies and your financial aspects of the plan have to be fully presented by 2024. So you can see the 2021 target. You're moving along very well to meet that timeline. And that's the information that we're using in order to populate the calculations that we're doing. So as you can see, we're doing most of or basically the best as we can define today. We're doing all of the right things that the province is seeking for you to do into the future. So we're doing that today. Next slide. And again. So I'm going to get into the calculations. And this is going to talk about customers, capital, how we're going to finance that, talk about operating expenditures, and basically come up with the rates. So our starting point is, what is your rate structure currently? And you can see on the water and the wastewater side, you have that base charge, which is a fixed amount, which is charged to the customer. And then on top of it, there's a volume related charge for the amount of water that you consume. And we use the water meter for both charging the water service, and we use that flow information as well in order to charge for wastewater, the wastewater service. So you can see right now, 1847 is the 5/8 and 3/4 is basically the average household. And as you move up those sizes, you're getting into like 1 inch and 1.5 inch. You're into small businesses, maybe small restaurants. And as you get into larger, you're getting into schools, you're getting into businesses that use a large amount of water. So that's how you've structured, you've increased the charge based on the size of the meters. Next slide. And if we look at how many of your customers are in both of all of those categories, you can see most of them are sitting as those small meters. So they're the residential. You've got 3,042 out of 3,053. So all but basically 11 customers are basically in those small meters. Same type of thing with wastewater. You've got 50 less customers on the wastewater side, which means they got municipal water, but they have their own private septic system. So, and we've been mindful of these differences in doing the calculations. On the non-residential side, you've got about 308 customers, both on the water and the wastewater side. Next slide. We take a look at the, so this is how we've forecasted over time the number of additional customers and the amount of additional water use, the volumes through the meters, how we've calculated the additional amount that we would expect for you to experience. If I look at the column starting from the left, we have the years, then it says total users. So these are the number of new users we would expect on the system each and every year over the next 10 years. So you can see for 2020, it was approximately 17. We're looking on average about 20 people per year. And then as we get towards the latter part, maybe rising up a little bit more to 22 persons per year. Now, if we go to as we move across and you can see these years, if you take a look at 2020 and you see that there were 17 users, we would have assumed for 2020 that those 17 people or 17 users, 17 new customers aren't going to be there as of January 1st. Some of those new users, you take out building permits, some will come on stream in March, some in June, some in September, some at the very end of the year. So what we've assumed is for the forecast is that those 17 new customers on average will generate a half a year's worth of revenue. And that's where you see, and you can see the 17, a half a year's revenue would be the equivalent of 9 full year people. So we've gone from, we've assumed half a year's worth of revenue generation. So we got 9, and then we go up for the rest of the forecast at the 17. And for 2021, we expect 20 people. In the first year, they'll generate the equivalent amount of revenue as 10, full-time customers. And then they'll go up, we'll go back to the 20. So we forecasted the equivalent number of customers on that basis. And so for the base charge, you can see that total line and the 227, you can see that each and every year we've added more customers paying that fixed amount into the into the revenues. We've also taken that and we've looked at the average usage per customer for the water system. And basically you're running at 131 cubic meters per year. So, what runs through the meters on average is about 131. So we've used that figure and we've multiplied it by the number of new customers. And that very bottom row tells us the added amount of flows that we'll have as part of the new billing rates. So when I move forward and we're doing the calculations, where we have these increased number of customers and we have these increased volumes. And of course, we're looking at recovering the dollars and we divide it by the customer information to come up with the rates. So that's why we've done these detailed calculations. And if we go to the next slide, this shows you the blue represents the residential, and you can see the total customers over time increasing, from the 3,062 up to almost 3,300 by 2030. And we've given you the corresponding volumes. Right now, the amount of volumes you're tracking through those meters is 652, almost 653,000 cubic meters of water. And you can see on the bottom there that we've added annual amounts. So that'll increase to the point of reaching about 681,000 cubic meters. The green, it represents the wastewater, and we've done the exact same thing. But remember, there's about 50 less customers in the system. So we've done the calculation basically on the total number of customers that are actually receiving wastewater service.
Gary?
Yes.
It's Arlene, it's Councillor Jameson. I just have a question. Can you go back 2 slides?
Certainly.
Back one more there. So when you say we're talking about residential, what do you qualify for non-residential? Is that business and like apartment buildings or what? Who is that?
That should basically be your schools, small businesses, offices, those type of customers. So it's been, through Carrie and Michael, they've categorized these,
Okay.
but I think that it's on that basis. And Michael, can you just confirm that for me that I got it right?
Yes, I guess as development proceeds, we're making certain assumptions based on our historical growth patterns. There will be like the Peen, for instance, they will have a larger meter. So they will probably be in that 3-inch range for their apartment complex. And it'll be a hybrid. It's kind of very difficult to predict exactly how it's going to roll out, but I think the numbers that they carried is sort of the growth that we've been seeing historically. And I think what this shows you in this breakdown of meters is that we don't have a very high or a very strong industrial base. The majority of the meters are residential meters, like the arm pryers and the sorts you'll see later on in the presentation, where their water rates are lower and they sell like 40% or 50% of their water to industry who is using significant amounts of water. We don't we don't have those. So the majority of our meters are smaller, and so they have less influence on being able to generate revenue in the larger meters because we don't have that many of them, and they're not very high consumption. So even the apartment buildings they're going to install a large meter, but cumulatively they're not very high consumption compared to an industrial user who would be using an equivalent size meter.
Okay, so okay. So here's my next question then. In just saying all of that, when you talk about industry, where would their meter be? Like, would they be like a 3-inch or a 4-inch, or do you have any idea? I'm just trying to.
Depending on the particular
usage.
industry and the usage. Yeah, so it's basically the larger meters are for people who use larger volumes of water. So
Okay.
we could have a Scapa tape using a 2-inch meter because they're not really heavy water users.
Right.
Or you could have a smaller industry like the ice cream factory using a larger meter because they're using lots of water.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Welcome.
Our pleasure. So if we move forward to, okay, so then basically the information we just presented is basically the denominator. So we're going to identify the costs, and it's divided by customer information, volumes, and that's how we come up with the rates. So those are the assumptions that we've used. And this is consistent with the approach that we've used over the last 15 years is forecasting in this manner. So the capital infrastructure, so this is looking at your needs for replacement, refurbishing, et cetera, as well as growth over the forecast period. So as I've noted, we've received the preliminary information from Dillon and from Aqua, and you'll be seeing that with their the information coming out of their asset management plan that you'll see soon enough. Now they accelerated the analysis on the water and the wastewater side. We don't anticipate many changes, if at any. So we have their draft information, which we've used. We've also, in talking with Aqua and Dillon, and then in conjunction with staff, so Michael and Carrie, we've refined the timing of when we expect to have to replace the various infrastructure. And then, as I've noted, there's growth-related works which were identified. So within areas of the town, there's additional water and wastewater, maybe pumping stations, pipes that have to be extended into those areas in order to allow them to hook up into the system. Now, we will be coming back to when we've finished the process with Aqua and Dillon to come back and take a look at the DC calculations. So we're just a little bit ahead of the curve with that. But I think, as I say, with the water and the wastewater, I think we're in the order of magnitude, but the charge actually may increase a bit when we finalize those calculations. Next slide. Next slide, please. So over the next two slides, and it's moving slowly, there we go. You can see that there's actually a sizable amount of capital that have been identified. So, there's the major capital works. There's a lot of reconstruction projects for the linear assets. Some of it's basically an annual amount of expenditure to address some of the sizable stuff. And then we have some specific projects that have been identified. There's improvements to the water treatment plant. And then we get into some of the stuff that Aqua deals with, which are more of the minor capital works, which are shown at the bottom. And on the next slide, you'll see that the growth-related works are identified here. So there's a number of different projects anticipated over the. Now, if you take a look at the years with the capital, we've actually pushed these to the latter part of the forecast because we're not quite clear when the specific areas will activate the growth. We know that those projects are there, but it's basically monitoring when those different development areas want to move ahead. So for the most part, we've set them to the latter part, but they can be pulled forward at any time into the forecast. And we would hope that you have the adequate development charges to fund it so that there's no direct impact onto your rates. However, I would say that if all of those projects had to be pulled together, pulled forward for this year, you haven't got enough development charge revenue to pay for it. So you'd be into a sizable amount of debt to cash flow this. Or alternatively, you might be asking the developers to perhaps assist in cash flowing or to build some of these works, and we'll flow back the capital to them in the future. So just on the growth related, I just want to highlight that right now, none of these works are affecting the rates, but as those developments come forward, we'll have to monitor your cash flow from the DC side in order to make sure you've got adequate funds. And on the wastewater side, you can see that once again, we have sizable amount of investments. A lot of this is dealing with the existing infrastructure. And you can see there's major linear works that are being provided for, pumping stations, refurbishing, renewal, and we've got the wastewater treatment plant. We've got capital works to construct there. Your water and your wastewater treatment plants, they were built, in mid 2005, 2010, in that range. So you're 10 to 15 years down the road. And as we go out, our forecast goes out 10 years. So you're looking at basically some of that infrastructure is now in the 20 to 25 year range. It needs to be addressed, refurbished, replaced over time. On the growth, once again, you can see that there's a number of projects there that are anticipated. Some of them will be built over the next couple of years, but then the majority we've put to the latter part of the forecast. Same type of observation that we did with the water. You're going to have to monitor your cash flow, make sure that you have adequate funding. And if you don't, then maybe we're debenturing or talking to the developers to help with the cash flow. When we come back with the development charge study, we will be spending a little bit more time with you and talking about some of the cash flow issues and options you have for assisting in financing that.
Yeah, so Gary, I'll just touch on that. I think that's maybe if we can go back one slide, Byron. And the growth related, Gary's indicated that, we're relying on development charges revenue to fund those projects that are going to be needed to service development. So through the development charge bylaw that's going to be coming forward, there's going to be a recommendation on how much development charge we should be charging per household to generate enough money to build this stuff as growth is happening. And there has been a tendency in a lot of communities, including Renfrew, to reduce that development charge from its maximum. So therefore, if we collect 80% or 70% of the eligible development charge, then we're only going to be generating 70% of the dollars required to build those projects. So it's like Gary said, we may have to end up borrowing money to build those projects and not recover the full amount. And the only way to pay off the debt is through the water and wastewater sales. So that will impact the rates directly. So if we're not diligent about the charging and development charges, those costs could land on the ratepayers for water and sewer charges.
That's a good point, Michael. I mean, if you look at this particular list of projects, you've got about $7 million out of your $20 million capital plan. With that $7 million, if you decided to only, let's say, collect 50 cents on the dollar for water and wastewater. That means the development charges will give you half of that $7 million. The other 3.5 million we will have to include in the rate calculations, which means the existing ratepayers will have to come up with the money to fund that other 50%. So if you collect at 100%, there should be no impact on your rates. But if you only choose to collect 75%, then we're taking roughly 1.7, 1.8 million that have to be funded here. If you go to 50%, then we got 3.5 million that we'll have to include in this calculation, which we haven't done at this time. So it's, with development charges, what we're doing, we're identifying projects. And if we fund those projects from basically charging new developments, then basically we have the money to build the infrastructure. If you choose to reduce it or not charge at all, then all of these expenditures have to be picked up off of the water rates and the wastewater rates. So there's a direct relationship between the rates we're presenting you and, or let's say the amount of money that you're collecting to fund these works and the rates we're presenting. Okay, so thanks for that, Michael. Next slide. And then, as I say, we've identified here the different options. If we take a look at gas tax funding, that's from external sources. So that doesn't hit the rates. That's government pass through, and you've allocated some of the funds to funding the water and the wastewater. There may be other grants, which is once again an external source. So that doesn't hit the rates. Then we have development charges, which should be an outside source. But as I say, if you discount and don't recover all of it, then it becomes partially funded by development charges and the rest coming off of the rates. And then once you've exhausted those opportunities, basically it's what you raise through your water bill and your wastewater bill. And you're either cash flowing it with debt, so we're debenturing, or we're trying to stockpile some money into the reserves, because right now it's a couple of years of low spending, but then we know in year 4 we got a huge amount of spending, so we're trying to build up the reserves in order to fund that and minimize the debt. So all of these items are taken into account when we're trying to forecast the funding for all of that infrastructure. And if we go to the next, and just where we're starting at is the development charges for water is about 274,000 in the reserve and 307,000 currently for wastewater. Remember, with wastewater, I said there's about $7 million of growth-related works. So we're starting with about 300,000 in the reserve, and we have to collect more to fund those expenditures, or it goes to debt, or if you're not collecting it all, it hits the rates. So we've got reasonably good water reserves. Wastewater reserves are about half that of the water reserves. As we move, so just, I guess we've already had this discussion, but when we come back and talk to you about development charges, we will talk that with growth, there's always impacts on having to build additional infrastructure to accommodate that growth. As you've seen with water and wastewater, we have to extend mains out to those new areas. We need pumping stations, etc. So that top oval basically says with growth, there's additional capital expenditures that have to be funded. And there's no magic because they're project costs. You either recover on the left-hand side as much as you can through the development charge to fund that project, or if you choose to discount it, then what you're doing is making a decision to put it over onto the water and the wastewater rates. And if you're looking at other services like roads or whatever, off of taxes. Okay, so keep in mind it's a very narrow triangle. You don't have to have DCs, but if you don't have DCs or you discount your DCs, there's an impact on your rates and taxes, or you try and recover as much as possible. So, next slide, please. So what we've provided for in, yeah, there it is. So as we've talked about, water is about 18 million, wastewater's a little over $20 million in expenditures. And what we've presented, or what we've calculated in the funding for this, is basically external grants and gas tax funding. On the water side, will generate probably in the range of 1.8, 1.9 million, and maybe about 1.9 million, $2 million on the wastewater side. The development charge, whether the funding, how we've assumed it right now is that these expenditures would be funded by the DC reserves or by negotiating with the developers to help with the cash flow, so that none of this has actually hit the rates. We're going to have to, we've anticipated a little bit of debt on the water side, and then you can see as we're building the reserves over year to year to year, we hope to have about $9.2 million in funding. So on the water side, we started with, I think, 2.4. We'll be adding more money to that reserve. So we've got the money to basically pay for as much of that capital as we can on a cash basis. On the wastewater, we start with about 1.2 million. So we've got to come up with almost $12 million in additional transfers to those reserves so we can fund the rest of the infrastructure. So the key thing here was to try and minimize the impact on debt and to try and basically be as sustainable as possible with the water and the wastewater system, which is what the legislation, the water and the wastewater legislation is taking us towards, is financial sustainability. Next slide. And to put the capital spending, the life cycle, the life cycle is the replacement, the asset, there's different terms, asset management, you can call it life cycle, but it's basically for existing assets, you're renewing it, you're replacing it, you're refurbishing it, you're doing something to either extend the life of it or to actually replace it and start a new life cycle for it. If we look at your water infrastructure, and keep in mind that your water infrastructure, the original system dated back to the early 1900s, so that there's still some parts of the system that are fairly old, which is why you're seeing a sizable amount of replacement. Similarly, on the wastewater, I think it dates back originally to the 1930s. So you've got almost $70 million in water, 69.18 million on the water side, and $72 million on the wastewater side. If you take a look at that and just say, I divide that by the number of customers we have, that's an investment of almost $23,000 per customer for water and $24,000 per customer for wastewater. So if you total it together, you've got $46 million invested per customer to get the water into the building, the home or the business. And then as they shower or, cook meals or do whatever, to get that wastewater out and treat it. So there's a very large amount of infrastructure per customer that you have in place to provide those services. So keep that in mind. If we said at 46, if we built the system today and you invested $46,000 per customer, and we said, oh, it'll last 100 years, you would at a minimum be looking at $460 per customer for your water and your wastewater. If that is 50 years old and you only have 50 years to replace it, you'd be saying, well, I need $920 a year per customer in order to replace it. So the big driver in right across Ontario, all of the water and the wastewater rates, the big driver is infrastructure and the capital side of your water bill. And if we take a look here, we just tried to represent those numbers. You can see that there's $141 million of assets for water and wastewater. So that's total replacement value, 141 million. And what we've identified in the capital plan is $27 million for replacement, renewal, refurbishment. That's only sitting there at about 20%. So the 10-year budget will provide for 20% replacement, which is the recommendations, as I say, that's coming through this process. And that's not unreasonable given the fact that a sizable amount of that has been, is aging fairly steadily, and you'll have to renew, replace, refurbish over time. So over this 10-year forecast, we're identifying about 20% of that infrastructure as part of our capital funding. Next slide. Now, just to talk about the operating expenditures. So from what you have today, most of the expenditure, so the Aqua contract right now is running at about 2.7% per year, and that's for the next couple of years. And then that's based on the current contract. And then we've assumed after that, basically inflation, 2% per year. Obviously, that'll be all subject to negotiation and such, but those are the assumptions we've included right now. For almost all the rest of the operating expenditures, once again, we've included it at 2%. 2% is not unrealistic. CPI last year was around 1%, but the year before that was running at around 3%. So you can see it kind of ebbs and tides. So we've, but if you look at the last 5 to 7 years, the average increase about 2% per year. So that's what we've assumed. If you look at utilities, so your hydro, for example, costs, chemicals, fuel, they've been running at actually on average about 5% per year. If we go back over 7 years, you can see that they're averaging. So for just those components, we've had a slightly higher amount of inflation that we've assumed over the next 10 years. And if we take a look, next slide, please. So if we take a look, and this is basically the forecast of the operating budget, and you can see the dark blue is your day-to-day operating costs. So that's the contract related to Aqua, that's pumpage, your hydro, that's cleaning the mains, that's doing all of the proper things, treating the water, distributing it, etc. Right now it's about $1.8 million. And that, at the percentage increases we talked about, that will naturally rise to about $2.2 million by 2030. The lighter blue that's there is the impact of the capital program we talked about. And we call it capital related, but that's debt charges and basically transfers to reserves, or maybe transfers directly to the capital program. That's the portion of your operating budget that deals with things that are related, influenced by the capital program. So debt charges, transfers to reserves, and maybe transfers directly to the capital program. You can see we've started at $770,000, and that will basically double over the next 10 years. So that sizable capital program will actually increase at a faster rate than what we anticipate the level of increases on the pure operating expenditure side. So once again, when I say the influence is the capital program, you can see that right here graphically where the influence is over the next 10 years on your water, the water side. Now, if we go to the wastewater side, you can see that the dark blue is the operating cost, and it's about 1.6 million. You can see that the capital related side is actually more. You're spending more money on the capital than you are on the day-to-day running of the wastewater system. And you can see over the next 10 years, we're going to the operating, the dark blue is going to go from 1.6 to about 1.9. And the dark, the green color will go from about 2 million to about 2.2 million. So fairly stable. We're going from 3.6 to about 4.2. So sizable amount of expenditures, but they're for the most part stabilized. So you've reached a level of with your operating capital system that you're basically stabilizing that system. So we're not seeing any big implications, at least at this point, over the next 10 years. Next slide. And one more. So I'm going to basically, we talked about a couple of different things. Right now you've got a base charge and you've got a volume rate. We've talked about the average consumption. So I'm going to show you the average water and wastewater bill using the 131 cubic meters, because that's the average consumption. So we'll show you that. But as I've noted, for water, we're going to increase the fixed component of the bill, but slow down the volume component of the bill. And on the wastewater side, we're going to have both the base and the volume increase at the same amount. Okay. So on the water, we're trying to put more fixed costs into the revenue stream, because it'll provide for a better stability, given you're having a sizable increase on the capital related side. Next slide, please. So sorry for all of this detail. I'm going to try and make it as simple as possible. If you look at the water, what we've done is the first two rows. That's what the base charge. I started at the beginning of the presentation showing you what the base charge is and showing you what the volume rate is. That's called a constant rate. As we move out over time, you can see that we've been increasing the monthly base charge. But if you look at that second row from the top, the constant rate, the volume charge, you can see we've frozen it at $2.58. So it stays at $2.58 until we hit 2025, and then we'll start both of them to increase over time. In total, your water bill is running at about a 4% increase on the water side. Remember, there's your water and your wastewater bill together are the total amount. And so you can see that the water bill is about just under $560. If you look at the same information on the wastewater, so you look at that just above on the wastewater, just above the yellow for 2020, you can see that the wastewater bill is just under $900. So for wastewater, we're going to increase that annual bill at about 1% per year. So it's the biggest chunk, and it's only going up at 1%. The water bill is the smaller component of it, but it's going up at 4%. And if we look at the bottom and you average them together, you combine the whole bill, it's actually in the early stages, 2.1% increase. And then when we get out to 2024, we're at, roughly 2.3, and then maybe we hit 2.4 at the peak.
Gary, if I could just ask a question, it's
Yep.
Don. I have my water bill in front of me, and the wastewater, you're right, $47.97 is the current base rate. But the current base rate that's shown on here is $36.94, not $18.47.
I'm not clear.
Well, that's what the base rate is. I don't know if you can see this or not.
Well, maybe that's something we'll have to look at, Mr. Mayor. So subsequent to this, Mr. Mayor, if you can pass it through staff and ourselves, then we'll take a look. We were pulling this off of your water bylaw, so.
If I may, Gary,
Oh, sorry.
Yep.
Yeah, go ahead.
it's Carrie, just to a matter of information, the rates being used in the forecast that's on the screen are monthly rates, and your water bill are bi-monthly rates, so double it. So 1847 times 2 is 3694, and 4797 times 2 should be your sewer base charge of 7388.
So the wastewater charge of 47.97 is for 2 months. The water
No.
charge for 1847 is for 1 month.
No,
correct?
what's the sewer charge on your bill, the base rate?
Base rate is
7388.
47.97.
You're getting a break. You're getting a break on it then, because it should be double that, according to the bylaw.
So you're saying my base rate that I'd be paying should be almost $100 just for sewer? I don't think you're right.
I'm looking at the bylaw that we passed. It says $73.88 per billing.
Anybody else got their bill there? My total base rate
Just
combined.
grab mine.
All right, my apologies. It is $47.97. I was looking at the out of town rate. So your water is $36.94 and wastewater is $47.97 bi-monthly.
That's right.
And Gary, you have to remedy your calculations here.
Okay,
So the 1847 should be doubled.
we'll take a look at that. It may be the presentation, the way that we've laid it out, and I apologize for that. I'll get back to you on that.
That changes the numbers dramatically, I would think.
I have.
Yep, we'll take a look at that, Mr. Mayor, and we'll be back to you.
Thank you.
It may just be the way we pull it forward, and I apologize for that. So at this point, we're looking at at these levels of increase, but we will reaffirm it through you, Mr. Mayor, and then be back to you.
Thank you.
And then the next slide just identifies a comparison of rates in other areas. You can see that you're at the higher end of the scale, not too far off of Bon Cherie Valley or Madawaska, a little bit less. But then Merrickville, Wolford, you're considerably less than them. Now, when we take a look at this, I think Carrie had indicated, or Michelle actually, that depending on the makeup of the customer base, if you have a lot of industry, such as like Kingston and such, then they have a tendency to compensate the residential bills a little bit more because there's higher volumes, more coming through. When you're into denser places like Ottawa and such, then you've got a lot of customers in a small amount of area. So the densities do play an impact on your asset management costs. So there's a number of different factors as well. Are you pulling water from a well? Are you pulling it from surface water, which could either be the river or could be a lake? So all of these different factors play into the cost associated with treating the water and basically treating the wastewater, and that's what reflects into the bills.
If I could just say something else, Gary, I think
Yeah.
if I got my numbers right, or if I got it right, I think Aaron Pryor, when they did a major expansion, they sent everybody out a one-time bill. I believe it's for like $2,800 or something, where we have a long debenture on our, on our wastewater plant.
There are, yeah, that's correct. Some municipalities, when they do improvements and such, they'll charge a special rate, a capital charge, and they don't incorporate that into the your water bill. They basically charge it on a capital basis. And you're right. I think there are some areas of Arnprior that have that capital charge. Most recently, I developed a capital charge for the downtown area for some of the improvements in that area. So they do utilize the that area capital charge quite a bit. So that can sway the numbers as well. I know that some municipalities have chosen to charge back the property taxes as well as a bit of a subsidy for some of their programs. But at the end of the day, water and wastewater have to be paid like any other service. So, next slide. So just a couple of things. We've talked a little bit about the water financial plan. This regulation, as I said, was an interim. It's not a true financial plan in that the original Sustainable Water and Sewage Systems Act, as well as the Water Opportunities Act, are looking at more of what we've done here. Evaluate your assets, take a look at the length of time, the cost associated with maintaining, replacing, refurbishing, and develop a long-term capital and operating budget to support that asset management plan. The water financial plan really is taking the information we've done through this calculation, and it basically has translated it into a financial statement format. So, when the auditors come forward every year, and you can understand how they've laid out how you normally see your operating budgets and your capital budgets, and you can see how they're very definitive in here's the expenditures and here's the amount of revenue we must generate. From the accounting side, they take that and they take it from kind of like a modified cash and they take it into a full accrual basis. So they restate it in a different format. So right now, that's the format the province wants us to present this information on. So if we go to the next slide. Yeah, so this is really, you can see I'm talking about PSAB, which is public sector accounting, is what they're looking for this to be translated into. And if we go to the next slide, and one more. Without getting into a lot of detail, for those that are accounting minded, the rate study is more of a cash basis. We do it like you normally do your operating and capital budgets. But as I say, if you take a look at that budget information and you can see your actuals, but then you see when your auditors come forward with the financial statements, it's been represented in a totally different format. And that's what we're doing. We call it a capital forecast. They use tangible capital assets. If we look at principal and interest debt payments, so we say we have to pay a certain amount of debt, we put that into the budget. When they use the financial statements, they only pull out the interest portion for the year and they report that. And then they take the value of the assets and based on historic values, and they use a depreciation. So without getting into a lot of the gory details, there's a difference in the way that a normal budget's put together and then how your auditors will represent that information into the standardized format. So that's what we would do from this work to provide it for the province and submit that document. And that's the one that's pending over the coming weeks that we need to submit to the province. Next slide, please. So I'm happy to entertain any questions. We will look into those matters that you raised, Mr. Mayor. And as I say, in part, it may be the way that we drew it forward, and I apologize for that. So we'll take a look and be back to you shortly on that.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate you looking into that because I see it two ways. One is possibility that the water is not calculated properly, but the other one could be that I'm not sure if one is calculated on a monthly basis or the other one's called on a bi-monthly basis. So it's because the bill comes out every 2 months.
Yep.
So I'm not sure where that all fits in. So if you wouldn't mind looking into that, I'd certainly appreciate it. Any questions? Dr. Aston.
Yes, and we will definitely confirm those. And if they change the percentages at all, then we'll come back before a group like this again, just to review and confirm the numbers prior to bringing something that's significantly different, bringing it forward to council. So we'll certainly review that in detail.
Okay. Anything else from anyone? Okay. Then I guess that's the end of the meeting then. If there's no other questions, do you have any final comments, Gary?
No, that's it. As I say, from this point, we would move forward to once we provide that double that review that we've talked about. We need to move ahead to provide you with the documentation to support this. So we give you the rate study, and then we would provide that financial plan that has to be submitted to the province.
Okay, and when do we think we'll be getting that?
Over the next couple of weeks.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Rebimo.
Thank you. I'm just wondering if prior to any other, and I recognize that there's a lot of interconnected documents, but prior to any other meetings, if we could have the stuff a couple of days in advance. I'm quite old fashioned. I need to be able to get my yellow highlighter out and my blue pen and my red pen and connect dots and ask questions and scribble notes on it to the point it's unrecognizable, but it helps me. So, the presentation was good. I just haven't been able to formulate my thoughts just because we saw it for the first time this evening. Thank you.
Thanks for being more. I was just going to ask the very same question. Councillor Hines.
As was I. I do need a hard copy to read through things. And so once you sort out the rates, as the mayor has identified, then I wouldn't mind a copy of that so that I can go through it. But it was well presented, and thank you very much for that, Gary. It was good to see you again doing that. You certainly are familiar with our water rates and our water systems. For many years we've done that, and that's great. So I'm looking forward to a hard copy of that so I can kind of read through it again.
We will provide that through you, Mr. Mayor.
Okay. If there's nothing else, Clerk Bulmer, do we need a confirming resolution, or can we just go to adjournment?
We can just go to adjournment, Mayor Edie.
Okay, then we need a motion to adjourn. Councillor Hines, second by Councillor Jamison. Thank you, everybody, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Take care.